product of the time when it was made. The politics, the social dynamic, everything. You could see a film about the Crusades, for instance, of medieval England that was made in the 1930s. Hollywood made a lot of these movies, but some of them were made in the 30s, some of them were made in the silent era, the 20s. Some were made in the 30s, some were made in the 50s, some were made in the 70s. And even though they're all about the same thing, they have the same kind of costumes and maybe slightly better technology, but otherwise they're pretty much the same. But the energy about the film is so different. When Laurence Olivier made Shakespeare's Henry V in 1943, it was during the Second World War. The energy of that film is all about the war. It's about the defense of England against Germany. That's the subtext that isn't quite there, but you know it's there when you see the film. But there have been other versions of Henry V. Kenneth Branagh made a version of Henry V just 10 years ago, 12, 15 years ago, whenever it was, and it has an entirely different energy. The dialogue is exactly the same, from the same basic material. So yes, the film is definitely a product of its time. But also, in addition to that, the studios had a lot more power in the earlier days, right up until the end of the 60s. And they made what they wanted to make that was based on their own senses of the kind of films that they liked. So you could have a situation where you could go into the head of the studio and you could say, look, I don't like this script much that you want me to direct, but I'll do it if you let me do this other film that I really like. And those kind of deals were made all the time. Now, they don't. Now they're worried about the bottom line, and most of the studios are run by big corporate enterprises who are run by accountants. And they're not interested in doing anything that's at all difficult or controversial. So they only want to make the big films that they know, what they call tentpole films now, which they know are going to appeal to a very wide and large audience. And so the little films have to be made by somebody else, the smaller companies and independent companies that don't have that agenda. So the energy there is quite different. So and then also, as I said, the politics of the era has a lot to do with it. So if you look at films made in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, the kind of the tail end of the kind of hippie revolution and the anti-establishment aspect of society at that time, it's very evident, very obvious that that's what's going on there. And as before that, in the 1950s, there was a whole energy about kind of fitting in society with no challenge at all. You just did what everybody told you to do. And some films rebelled against that, but most of them fit that mold too. So you look at each decade and you can kind of tell what films were made.
I'm sure as a producer, in terms of shooting.
Favorite scene, that's an interesting one. Well, in the original Star Wars film, probably one of the scenes that we all remember quite fondly was probably the cantina scene, because it was so silly. You know, basically it was intended to be silly, and the idea was that we would make it like a kind of 1930s bar, and with a lot of strange characters in it. But even then we had some problems with it, because Stuart Freeborn, who was the makeup supervisor, got ill and couldn't finish some of the characters' heads that we needed, and so we shot what we had, and then later in Los Angeles we did some inserts of other heads. Rick Baker provided some existing heads that he had from other films, horror films and other odd things, and we shot the band there too, because we finally had John Williams music. And I told John that I wanted it to sound like Benny Goodman and have that kind of 1930s feel. But he used all these strange electronic instruments, which worked really well. But when we were shooting the band, everybody that's in the band costumes were from ILM. We just recruited all these people, model makers and things from ILM to shoot that day. And they put on these heads that we'd shoot, and the two of them passed out because there was no breathing. So I had to take my trusty Swiss Army knife and cut holes and slots down the back of the heads because the people, they just came right from the modelers, and there was nobody thought about breathing, of course. So that was probably one of the, and it works fine in film, and it's just kind of a giggle to see. So that's probably one of my, I don't think that on Empire, I think shooting in Norway was not the most fun, but the results worked. I mean, we had a lot of trouble there with weather, and it was really cold, and we got, when we first arrived in Norway at the ski lodge at Finse, there was this huge blizzard had gone on for 3 days before, and we had to, or the Norwegians dug this tunnel from the railway station to the ski lodge, and we had 25 feet of snow, and we weren't sure we were going to be able to work, but we did drive the snowcats up onto the glacier and shoot almost every day that we were there, but it took twice as long as would have. But the results were quite good, and both Kurtz and I were disappointed that the weather was so cold that you couldn't see the breath of the people. There's a kind of unique phenomenon that if the weather gets below freezing and you can see people's breath, that only works down to a certain point. You have to have moisture in the air. If it gets too cold, the moisture disappears from the air and it gets all dry, and you don't see the breath anymore, so it doesn't look as cold. So we were stuck. We talked about this idea of putting dry ice in people's mouth and little cages. But it was considered too dangerous.
Today you just CG the breath.
Yeah, you can CG the breath in now.
Yeah.
Films have a really troubled history. I helped Patrick put that together a bit. It was all financed by various elements of business people in Chicago. And
so this is a film
77 or 5/25/77, and the titles come back and forth a lot. It's about a fan, a young kid in Chicago who was a film nut in high school. This is actually a true story. And he went up to Hollywood,